Well, the comments recently by the White House about Fed Chair Jerome Powell bring us back to a concern over Fed independence that we saw pop up in the first Trump administration. Now, the importance of independence of the Federal Reserve is vital on the path to fiscal policy, yet it's seemingly challenged by the beliefs of both the president and some of his advisors. But how much concern should there be right now? Peter Conti-Brown is an associate professor of financial regulation as well as legal studies and business ethics here at the Wharton School. He's also author of the upcoming book, Private Finance, Public Power, The History of Bank Supervision in America, which comes out June 24th. And he also wrote The Power and Independence of the Federal Reserve back in 2016. Hi, Peter. Great to talk to you again.
Glad to be here, Dan.
So as this is all played out, especially in the last couple of weeks, give us your thoughts on this again, this kind of having to focus on the topic of independence of the Federal Reserve.
We never stop focusing on it, I think, and for good reason. The Federal Reserve has been endowed with extraordinary powers over our economy and through the economy, our society. And it's right for us as citizens and for the politicians we elect to hold the Fed to account and to be curious and even sometimes skeptical of the Fed's powers. That's called democratic accountability. But what we don't want to do is destroy it. We don't want to destroy what makes the Federal Reserve so important, and its insulation from the day-to-day of the 24-hour press cycle or the whims of any president, Republican or Democrat. That's the stuff that we want to guard against. Not because we think that the Federal Reserve is some, Delphic oracle that knows things that can't be discerned from anyone else, by anyone else in any other way, but it's because we think that turning monetary policy and economic policy over to a loyalty test to any one individual will create bad policy. And so we never stop focusing on it because we're always trying to get that line right between democratic accountability, which is good, without eroding technocratic expertise, which is also good. And so that balance is what we're trying to strike.
So talk a little bit about the kind of, as the Federal Reserve was developed many, many years ago, the importance of independence as a concept in its abilities over time to be able to put forth the policy that has kind of helped drive our economy in general.
You're right. It's a great question, and history has given us lots of examples, good and bad, about how this has worked. At the beginning in 1913, what we now call Fed independence, it wasn't called that at the time. It was more about letting bankers be bankers. So the idea is that bankers know best, and so they'll know how to manage the economy in the interests of essentially profit maximization and loss minimization to the banks themselves. And the banks that I'm talking about are the Federal Reserve banks. But that kind of independence, quote unquote, led to the Great Depression. That's overstating it just a little bit, but Federal Reserve bankers acting in the interests of their shareholders are what made the Great Depression great. They just did too little of the kind of central banking that we'd want to see. Today, central bankers don't think of themselves as bankers per se. They think of themselves as technocrats, as experts. And over time, what we have learned over many decades of experience is that when we let those experts keep their eye on the medium term, then they're going to create policy that's better for all of us. Not perfect. We've seen some errors coming out of central banks and not just the last decades, but in the last few years. So no one's claiming that central bankers are going to be perfect at their jobs. What we're saying is that they're going to be better than the alternative. And the alternative is setting interest rate policy from the Oval Office according to the whims of whatever the president wants to see that day. And that's the main alternative to central banking, and that's what's under threat today.
Well, you gave the one example from the past, but how frequently have we seen the independence of the Federal Reserve kind of tested by elements of the federal government over time?
It's happened many, many times to lesser and greater extents. But there's been no president in U.S. history quite so enthusiastic about pulling down institutions like Donald Trump. And that was true in his first administration, and it's true now too. What the Federal Reserve represents to President Trump is just sort of a separate power center. It's something that he's not controlling. We've seen his reactions to other kinds of separate power centers in the media, in the judiciary, in the military. certainly in Congress, in universities, and we see it in central banks too. So I'll say that there is bipartisan enthusiasm from presidents going back to Woodrow Wilson and almost a steady through line until Donald Trump of being extremely impatient with the Fed. That's like
Right.
part of the job. When you
Right.
take your oath of office, there's like an asterisk that says also always be wondering if the Fed is going to be in your interests. The difference is what you do about it. And there, President Trump has shown himself to really vent his spleen on social media against the Federal Reserve. And I think the key point here, Dan, is that there are consequences to this. And those are the consequences that worry me the most. Because so much about Fed independence is about norms and conventions. These kinds of tweets, they undermine that independence in exactly that way.
Well, and I guess even as we sit here today, there's a conversation about upcoming Federal Reserve meetings and whether or not we will see another rate cut by the Federal Reserve. And to a degree, it does make you wonder whether or not some of this commentary is having some sort of impact. And obviously, Fed Chair Powell has talked a lot about the data, but still there is that question of when we see that next rate cut, is it somewhat influenced by what we've seen play out here?
I think it's such an important question. And, Chair Powell would say absolutely not. We never let that kind of thing influence our thinking. And I think he's both right and wrong about this. Yeah, he's definitely right in the sense that it is not in Jay Powell's DNA to capitulate like this. And so I don't think he's scared of Donald Trump. I think he's ready to fight this out for sure. But the narratives, the headlines after a cut that the Chair Powell and his colleagues will say is justified on the data will always include every single one. These articles will include this fight in it, and that shapes the narrative about the Fed, and it shapes the narrative about the Fed's legitimacy, and it gives people questions to explore and think about. That the Fed should not and does not want them to be thinking about, which is exactly this question: did the Fed cut in reaction to Donald Trump? Now, there's a bigger problem too with this, and that is right now we're seeing the Fed have to make some calls and decisions about some hard challenges. But what we're also seeing is we have a dynamic economy. Some very strange things are happening in it. And the great glory of the Federal Reserve is it is a dynamic policymaking body. So it can't just do what has always been done in the face of changing circumstances. It's going to need to do new things. And in order to do new things, like we saw in 2008 after COVID-19, many other instances, requires political cover. You can't have experimental central bankers who are simultaneously managing a battle with the sitting president. And so when President Trump tries to demean the Federal Reserve in this way, he's limiting their power of maneuverability, and that's extremely unfortunate.
Peter, appreciate the time today. Thanks very much. All the best.
All the best to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Wharton's Peter Conti-Brown, as we mentioned, author of the upcoming book, Private Finance, Public Power, due out on June the 24th.